Hey friends, tonight we begin with Sucked to be a Medieval Assassin. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy this kind of slow, calming storytelling. Your support means the world and helps me keep creating peaceful spaces like this one. Tell me no in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how this little quiet corner of the internet brings together people from all over the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or some soft background, and let's gently into tonight's journey together. Imagine, for a moment, slipping into the shoes of a medieval assassin. Not the glorified version you've seen in video games or films with hidden blades, daring rooftop chases, or cloaks that flutter dramatically in the moonlight. No, the reality of such a life was much harsher, lonelier, and often unbearably exhausting. To understand why it truly sucked to be a medieval assassin, you have to push aside all the romanticized illusions and instead step into the narrow, shadowed alleyways, the smoke-filled taverns, and the dimly lit chambers of medieval Europe, where danger lurked at every corner and the margin for error was razor thin. The first thing you might realize is that being an assassin in medieval times was not even a recognized profession. Unlike the soldier who had a lord to swear allegiance to, or the craftsman who had a guild to protect him, the assassin lived entirely in the margins of society. He was a ghost among men, someone who could not advertise his skills, who could not openly brag of his talents, and who had no banner to rally under. He was both needed and despised, both feared and discarded. This duality, the tension of existing in a society that wanted you for its dirtiest work but denied you a place of honor, was the foundation of why this life was far more miserable than many might imagine. Let's begin with the sheer physical reality of being such a person. An assassin, by necessity, had to live close to poverty. There were no steady contracts, no regular wages, and no guarantee that the next job would come in time to fill his stomach. Meals were inconsistent. Bread might be hard and stale. Meat was often out of reach, unless stolen or offered by a temporary employer. Hunger was not a distant threat, but a constant companion. Imagine moving through the cold stone streets of a medieval town at night, your stomach empty, your cloak thin and patched, and yet you had to steel yourself for the possibility of scaling walls, creeping into guarded chambers, or escaping across rooftops. Every ounce of strength mattered, and starvation eroded that strength day by day. Clothing was another burden. The assassin could not stand out. He could not wear fine fabrics or embroidered tunics, for those drew the eye and whispered of wealth. Instead, he dressed like the common laborer in coarse wool or linen, often patched and worn. In winter, the garments provided little insulation. In summer, the heavy, unwashed fabrics clung with sweat. Unlike the stories that present assassins with perfect hoods and elegant belts of weaponry, reality demanded that tools be hidden, crude, and ordinary-looking. A knife might be nothing more than a kitchen blade. A garrote could be a piece of rope. Carrying a crossbow openly would have been suicided, attracted the attention of city guards. Thus, every weapon had to be concealed, improvised, or disguised as something harmless. This necessity limited choices and made each mission more precarious. Even before an assignment began, the assassin lived under constant scrutiny. Medieval towns and cities were not sprawling, anonymous places like modern metropolises. They were tight-knit, with everyone knowing everyone else's business. A stranger moving through the market could not avoid curious eyes. A new face at the tavern would be noted. gossiped about, and remembered. Privacy was a rare luxury. To survive, an assassin had to master the art of blending in, of crafting identities as easily as he crafted lies. Today he might be a mason looking for work, tomorrow a wandering pilgrim, the next day a traveling merchant with dubious wares. Yet each disguise was fragile, for in towns where reputations spread faster than fire, one slip of the tongue could unravel weeks of careful pretending. Beyond this constant paranoia, there was the nature of the work itself, killing in the middle. Ages was not as simple as slipping poison into a cup or sliding a blade between ribs. Castles and manors were guarded by watchmen, dogs, thick walls, and iron gates. Even a wealthy merchant might have hired guards sleeping just outside his chamber. Unlike the fantasy of slipping in unseen, the reality involved long hours of observation. The assassin might spend weeks watching the routine of a target when he left his house, who he dined with, which door he preferred, whether he trusted his servants. This observation required patience beyond endurance. Imagine standing for hours in a muddy street corner, pretending to mend your shoe, all while memorizing when the candlelight in an upper window flickered out. Each moment you risked being questioned by guards, suspected by neighbors, or exposed by accident. The mental strain was unrelenting, and when the act itself came, it was rarely clean. Blades in medieval times were not surgical. A knife thrust might kill instantly, but more often it was messy, loud, and agonizingly slow. Blood sprayed across floors. Victims cried out, alerting guards. Even poison, one of the assassin's supposed tools, was unreliable. Herbs and concoctions, available in medieval Europe, were inconsistent in strength. Some victims merely grew sick for days instead of dying quickly, and suspicion naturally fell upon those nearby. The assassin had to vanish before consequences caught up, leaving behind chaos that sometimes implicated the wrong people, sometimes no one at all, but always carried the risk of vengeance. This is where another harsh truth emerged. Assassins were rarely respected, even by those who hired them. Nobles who whispered their desires for a rival's death treated the assassin as a tool, nothing more. Payment might be promised, but withheld. Betrayal was common. A lord might denounce the assassin publicly once the deed was done, claiming shock and horror to deflect suspicion. The assassin might be hunted by the very men who had once employed him. There was no oath of loyalty binding employer and killer. Only convenience tied them together, and convenience was fleeting. And then there was the ever-present weight of religion and morality. Medieval Europe was steeped in Christianity, and sin was no abstract concept. Murder was among the gravest. Even if an assassin hardened his heart to his work, he could not escape the whispers of priests or the tolling of church bells that reminded everyone of heaven and hell. To be an assassin was to live in a constant shadow of damnation. Confession was dangerous for revealing too much risked exposure. Silence was damning, for it left the conscience to rot. Imagine kneeling in a darkened church, hearing the prayers of peasants beside you, their voices rising in desperate hope, and knowing that your own soul had little hope of redemption. That gnawing doubt must have weighed heavily on the assassin. Night after night, sleep was no reprieve. Assassins could not rest deeply, for fear of betrayal, capture, or revenge. Beds were often little more than straw pallets in dingy inns, shared with lice, fleas, and the stench of unwashed bodies. Every creak of the floorboards, every shout in the street outside could rouse him with dread. Dreams might replay the faces of the dead, or worse, conjure scenarios of discovery. Waking each morning meant shouldering the same burden again: suspicion, hunger, danger, loneliness. This loneliness cannot be overstated. Few would trust a man who killed for coin. Even thieves had camaraderie in their guilds, and soldiers had brothers in arms. Assassins walked alone. Friendships were fragile, for to reveal one's true work was to risk exposure. Lovers were fleeting, often paid or fleetingly deceived. To carry secrets so heavy meant never truly unburdening oneself. Loneliness stretched across years until silence became the only constant companion. And so, to be a medieval assassin was to be trapped in a cycle of hunger, fear, secrecy, and guilt, without the reward of glory or lasting wealth. There were no monuments raised in their honor, no songs sung of their deeds. Their names, if remembered at all, were cursed and spat upon. To live in the shadows meant also to die in them, often forgotten, sometimes hunted, always unloved. If the assassin's life was marked by loneliness, fear, and hunger, it was equally defined by the unforgiving environments of the medieval world. Picture the narrow lanes of a medieval city after sunset. The day's clamor has died down, and with it the bustling voices of merchants, the clattering of hooves on cobblestones, and the shouts of apprentices hauling goods. At night, the city transforms into something far more sinister. Torches sputter in iron brackets, leaving long patches of darkness between faint pools of light. Smoke from the hearths hangs in the air, mingling with the pungent stench of rotting refuse and chamber pots emptied into the streets. Dogs bark, rats scurry, and in the distance, the groan of a tavern door signals the last drunkard stumbling home. For most townsfolk, this is the hour of rest. For the assassin, it is the hour of work. Moving through such an environment required not only stealth, but endurance. Cobblestones were slick with rain or mud, threatening a misstep. Roof tiles cracked under careless weight. Lantern light could betray the shadow of a figure. The assassin was forced to become intimate with the rhythm of the city itself, which streets the watchman patrolled, which alleys were safe to duck into, which baker rose before dawn to stoke his ovens, and which windows were left open on summer nights. In this way, the assassin was like a student of human routine, memorizing the most ordinary patterns of life, all for the sake of exploiting them. But this endless observation was exhausting in itself, for it required constant vigilance, like holding one's breath for hours on end. The assassin's tools were rarely glamorous. Popular imagination paints them with hidden blades and masterwork. Daggers, but reality leaned more toward what was readily available. A long knife, sharp enough to cut bread or meat, might also be used to slip between ribs. A belt, innocuous when wrapped around a tunic, could double as a strangling cord. A pouch of powders and herbs might contain poison, though these were often crude and unreliable. The assassin might rely on belladonna, wolfsbane, or arsenic, but dosages were imprecise, and victims could suffer long, loud deaths that defeated the very purpose of stealth. Even crossbows, often imagined as silent killing tools, were cumbersome, noisy to reload, and illegal to carry in many towns unless one was a soldier. Thus, much of the assassin's so-called arsenal was nothing more than adapted household tools, dangerous in skilled hands, but not without risk of exposure. Yet even the possession of such items was perilous. Medieval law was harsh and suspicious. Being caught with a concealed blade, a vial of powder, or even rope knotted in a certain way could arouse immediate accusations of ill intent. City guards were not kind men. Their justice was swift and brutal. An assassin discovered with incriminating tools might be flogged, tortured for confession, or simply executed outright. The very act of preparing for a mission could therefore doom the assassin before he even set foot near his target. Consider, too, the constant balancing act between visibility and invisibility. An assassin could not vanish entirely from public life, for that itself drew suspicion. Neighbors noticed if a man never spoke, never drank at the tavern, never attended mass. In communities where gossip spread like wildfire, aloofness was dangerous. Thus, the assassin was forced to live a kind of double life. Ordinary by day, dangerous by night. By day, he might haul water, buy bread, or exchange coins with a cobbler, blending in with the masses. By night, he slipped through shadows with lethal intent. This duality required not only careful performance, but also an emotional detachment that eroded the soul. Perhaps the most grueling burden of all was betrayal. For every mission, there was an employer, be it a noble, a merchant, or sometimes even a clergyman. These patrons did not view the assassin as human. To them, he was a tool, an expendable blade to be cast aside once used. Payment was often delayed, undercut, or withheld entirely. Worse still, when the deed was complete, some employers betrayed their hired killer immediately, offering him up as a scapegoat to avoid suspicion themselves. Imagine the bitter irony of risking one's life in shadowy corridors, killing a man under cover of night, only to find oneself declared a criminal the following morning by the very person who paid for the act, and the punishments for a captured assassin were horrific. Torture was not only a possibility, but a near certainty. Authorities prized confessions, names of employers, or even just the spectacle of pain as deterrent. The rack, the strappado, the Iron Maiden, these were not idle threats, but realities that awaited those caught in the act of murder. Death itself was slow, cruel, and public. Hanging, burning, beheading, or worse, being broken on the wheel. The assassin knew that discovery meant not merely death, but a prolonged, agonizing end. Watched by crowds who spat curses and hurled stones. The psychological strain of this constant threat was immense. Every job carried not only the risk of failure, but the certainty of fear. Each creak of a door, each bark of a dog, each shift of a guard's lantern was enough to quicken the assassin's pulse. Even when successful, relief was fleeting. Every victory was followed by the terror of flight, the need to escape unnoticed, and the dread of possible betrayal. There was no moment of true rest, no safe haven. Even sleep was poisoned with anxiety. One might imagine that at least wealth compensated for these risks, but that, too, was largely illusion. Payment was inconsistent. A noble might offer a handsome purse for a dangerous mission, but more often than not, sums were paltry. Enough to buy bread, ale, or temporary lodging, but never enough to secure long-term comfort. Unlike mercenaries, who could amass spoils of war, assassins rarely left behind legacies of wealth. They lived job to job, coin to coin, always one step from starvation. For many, the cycle was unbreakable. Risk death for a handful of silver, spend it to survive, then risk death again. Even their reputation offered no solace. Unlike knights, who were celebrated in song and story, or even thieves, who might gain notoriety in folklore, assassins left little mark on history. Their deeds were whispered of in scandal, condemned in sermons, and feared in rumor, but never honored. No one carved their names into stone or painted them into murals. They were shadows, and shadows left no legacy. to dedicate one's life to such a path was to embrace not only danger but erasure. And in this erasure, the assassin's humanity slowly withered. The necessity of detachment, the need to see every victim not as a living soul, but as a target corroded the mind. Imagine forcing yourself, night after night, to view people as obstacles, as means to an end, rather than as men and women with families, hopes, and fears. Over years, this outlook calcified into coldness. Loneliness deepened, and the assassin became a stranger not only to society but to himself. Thus, the life of a medieval assassin was not one of glamour but of grinding misery. It was hunger gnawing at the belly, fear clawing at the mind, betrayal lurking at every corner, and death looming in every shadow. To live this life was to carry a burden few would envy, and fewer still would survive for long. If one wonders how a man ever became an assassin in the medieval world, the answer is rarely simple. Unlike knights, who were trained from boyhood in the arts of war, or monks, who entered the cloister through family arrangement, assassins were often made by desperation. Many began life as orphans, beggars, or exiles, men with no craft, no land, and no hope of climbing through the rigid social ladder of the Middle Ages. In a world where survival demanded labor, land, or protection, those who had none were left to shadows. Some found their way to thieves' guilds, where the skills of silence, lockpicking, and concealment were honed. Others were pressed into service by powerful patrons who valued loyalty less than expendability. Training, when it could be called such, was neither formal nor noble. There were no manuals of instruction, no academies of stealth. Instead, a would-be assassin learned through trial, error, and cruel lessons in failure. He might be told to follow a man through a market without being noticed, and if he failed, he was beaten. He might be sent to steal from a guarded storeroom, and if caught, he was abandoned to face the punishment alone. In this way, the craft was not taught with patience, but forged through pain. Those who survived became skilled. Those who faltered disappeared, their names forgotten. The art of silence was perhaps the most difficult skill of all. Moving unseen in a medieval environment was far harder than one might imagine. Wooden floors creaked, doors groaned on their hinges, and cobblestones echoed with every step. Footwear was crude, soles stiff and noisy. To master movement was to master patience. The assassin learned to time his steps with gusts of wind, barking dogs, or the tolling of bells. He learned to press his body into walls, to become part of the architecture of the night. This training was not glamorous, but grueling. Every muscle burned with stillness. Every nerve screamed with tension. Failure was not an option, but it was a constant reality. Imagine the assassin slipping into a courtyard to end the life of a merchant, only to find a servant awake at an odd hour, carrying out the ashes of a fire. The plan, so carefully rehearsed, collapsed in an instant. At such times, the assassin had only two choices: flee or kill the witness. But flight was rarely successful, and killing created noise and mess. More than one assassin met his end, not during the act itself, but in the panic of improvisation when plans unraveled. Paranoia became the assassin's closest companion. Every shadow seemed to conceal danger. Every face might hide suspicion. Sleep was fractured and uneasy, for who could rest when betrayal might come at any hour? If the assassin had allies, they could just as easily turn into informants under pressure or torture. If he had patrons, they could betray him the moment his usefulness waned. Even food and drink became sources of fear. Many assassins ate sparingly and drank cautiously, terrified that their enemies or even their supposed friends might poison them in turn. The paranoia extended beyond waking hours. Nightmares plagued their sleep. Dreams of capture, of fire, of wheels breaking bones, of the gibbet looming against the dawn. The assassin might wake in cold sweat, dagger clutched in hand, staring into the darkness as if expecting guards to burst through the door at any moment. Over years, this state of constant tension hollowed a man out, leaving behind a shell of suspicion and fear. Survival demanded tricks, and assassins developed many. Disguise was among the most common. A hood could make a man anonymous, but true. Disguise meant more. The walk of a peasant, the stoop of an old man, the hurried shuffle of a servant. By changing posture, tone, and clothing, an assassin could slip unnoticed into spaces where no armed stranger would be tolerated. Yet disguise carried risk as well. If discovered, the pretense collapsed, and the punishment for deception was often harsher than the crime itself. Some relied on poison not for killing, but for incapacitating. A pinch of powder slipped into ale might make a guard drowsy. A drop of herb tincture in food could cause sickness, distracting a household long enough for the assassin to complete his work. But herbs were fickle, their potency varying from one harvest to the next. Too little, and the victim lived. Too much, and they died, screaming, alerting everyone within earshot. Others relied on alliances with those at society's margins. Prostitutes, thieves, tavern keepers, even lepers all could serve as eyes and ears for the assassin, passing on rumors, pointing out opportunities, or offering safe places to hide. Yet these alliances were fragile, built on coin or fear, and could dissolve in an instant if better offers came along. Trust was a luxury the assassin could rarely afford. Even escape was never certain. Medieval towns were ringed by walls and gates, shut fast at night. To leave a city after a killing meant scaling stone, bribing a guard, or finding a sally port known only to a few. The danger was greatest in those moments after a deed was done, when heart still pounded and breath came heavy. Each minute of delay increased the chance of discovery, each step toward freedom haunted by the possibility of capture. Many assassins, despite completing their mission, never reached the safety of the open road. And so, the assassin's craft was not simply one of violence, but of endurance, of hunger, of fear, of betrayal, of constant vigilance. The skills learned were not glamorous, but desperate. How to quiet one's breath, how to mimic another's walk, how to sleep lightly, how to strike quickly and vanish faster still. But even these skills could not guarantee survival. For every assassin who lived long enough to grow skilled, many more fell to blades, ropes, or fires, remembered only as nameless criminals. The profession offered no old age, no gentle retirement. Its practitioners were either forgotten in shallow graves or cursed in sermons as damned souls. To be a medieval assassin was to walk a path lined with shadows, one that narrowed with each passing year until all that remained was darkness. The methods by which a medieval assassin carried out his work were as varied as the settings in which he lived. Some favored the blade, simple and direct. A small dagger was easily concealed, light enough to carry, and silent in use. It could be slipped between ribs, pressed against a throat, or plunged into a back with brutal efficiency. Yet daggers required closeness, and closeness required courage. Few men could stand within arm's reach of their victim without trembling, for in those moments every heartbeat thundered like a drum. Others relied on bows or crossbows, striking from a distance. These weapons allowed the assassin to kill without direct contact, but they came with their own burdens. A bow demanded space to draw, steady aim, and calm hands, even under fear of discovery. A crossbow, though easier to aim, was slow to reload, and the distinctive sound of its mechanism could betray the shooter's location. More than one assassin who chose this method found himself trapped after the first shot, cornered before he could slip away. Poison, too, remained a constant temptation. It promised quiet deaths, free of noise and struggle. A cup of wine laced with deadly herbs, a slice of meat dusted with venom, a vial poured into a steward, all seemed simple. But poison was an uncertain art in the Middle Ages. The knowledge of dosage was imprecise, and many substances acted slowly, sometimes taking days to kill. In that time, suspicion could grow, and whispers could spread. If the target fell ill but lingered, healers might detect foul play, and suspicion would soon fall upon the one who had access to food and drink. The assassin's work, instead of being invisible, would become a tale of intrigue, and his own name might be drawn into the story. Strangulation and suffocation were cruder but equally feared methods. A rope around the neck, a pillow pressed against a face, or even hands tightened in desperation. These were intimate forms of killing, and they left behind bodies that bore clear signs of violence. Such methods often took longer than expected, with victims thrashing and gasping in their final moments. This created noise, commotion, and a high risk of discovery. Few assassins chose this path unless no other was possible. Every method carried with it the threat of capture, and if an assassin was caught in the act, his fate was grim beyond imagining. Medieval justice was neither quick nor merciful. Interrogation meant torture, designed not only to extract truth, but also to serve as a warning to others. The rack, the iron boots, the strappado, and the branding iron were all tools of interrogation, and an assassin could expect to feel their bite. Under such agony, the strongest wills broke. Names of patrons were revealed, contacts betrayed, and secrets spilled. To be an assassin was to live with the constant knowledge that pain awaited at the end of failure, and execution followed swiftly after confession. Hanging was common, but not always the most feared. Some were burned, their ashes scattered as an eternal warning. Others were broken on the wheel, their bones shattered in public view. Still others were displayed in gibbets, their bodies left to rot as carrion for birds. An assassin's death was designed not merely to end his life, but to erase his memory. With terror, few were granted a burial, and fewer still a prayer. Yet even for those who avoided capture, life offered little comfort. They rarely accumulated wealth. Payment was often modest, and coin, once spent, vanished quickly. Assassins had no estates to pass down, no legacies to leave. Their children, if they had any, inherited only shame. In sermons, priests thundered against such men, calling them tools of the devil, their souls condemned to eternal fire. To the church, the assassin was the very embodiment of sin murder without honor, violence without justice, death without cause. This meant that even after death, their memory was poisoned. Knights were remembered in ballads, kings in chronicles, monks in illuminated manuscripts. But assassins were remembered only in whispers, their names preserved not in glory but in fear. If they were mentioned at all, it was as cautionary figures, reminders of betrayal, cowardice, and corruption. They were shadows in history, known less for their deeds than for the terror they inspired. Imagine the assassin himself, in his final years if he was fortunate enough to survive so long. His body worn by sleepless nights, his nerves frayed by years of suspicion, his hands scarred from fights and blades. He had no land to till, no workshop to labor in, no guild to accept him. He might drift from town to town, living under false names, hiding among strangers. Each day, he might wonder whether some forgotten deed would rise up to claim him, whether a son of a victim would appear with a blade of vengeance, whether justice delayed might still find its way. And so, the life of a medieval assassin was not a tale of glory, nor one of riches, nor even of satisfaction. It was a path of fear, solitude, and endless danger. The very skills that kept him alive, suspicion, silence, violence, were the same skills that denied him peace. He was a man always moving, never resting, forever watching shadows for threats that might already be closing in. To many, the thought of such a profession may seem thrilling, even romantic. The idea of slipping unseen, of striking unseen, of shaping history from the darkness has always stirred the imagination. But the reality was far different. It was hunger, it was fear, it was betrayal, it was death. To live as a medieval assassin was to carry one's own grave in every step, to walk with doom as a constant companion, and to know that, in the end, the shadows gave nothing back. Thus, when we reflect upon why it truly sucked to be a medieval assassin, the answer lies not merely in the danger of the blade or the cruelty of punishment. It lies in the emptiness of the life itself, life where trust was impossible, safety a myth, and peace forever out of reach. If one wonders how a man became an assassin in the Middle Ages, the answer is rarely simple. Such men were not born into their profession, nor was it a trade openly taught. They came from the cracks in society, from lives already marked by hardship, violence, or isolation. Some were orphans, left without guidance or protection, forced to rely on cunning and strength in order to survive. Others were former soldiers, discharged after wars, their skills with the blade no longer useful to lords who no longer needed them. For these men, killing had already become a part of life, and when the wars ended, they sought new ways to apply. Their craft, recruitment, if it could be called that, happened through whispers. A merchant with rivals might know of a man who could make problems disappear. A lord might hear of someone willing to undertake deeds that no knight would sully his honor with. These connections spread quietly, built upon rumor, hints, and fear. No guild advertised assassins. No town criers announced their services. Instead, their reputation moved like smoke, curling from ear to ear, never settling long enough to be pinned down. Training, too, was rarely formal. There were no manuals, no written codes, no apprenticeships in the usual sense. Most assassins learned through necessity, trial, and error. A boy might be taught to steal before he learned to kill, slipping hands into purses, sneaking through. Shadows, theft, after all, required the same silence and nimbleness that later would make him a killer. Others were trained soldiers who already knew how to wield a sword or bow, their only lesson being how to use those tools outside of the battlefield. Still, certain skills were prized above all others. Patience, for one. To wait in silence, sometimes, for hours or even days, demanded a stillness of mind that few possessed. An assassin could not fidget, cough, or grow restless, for the smallest sound might betray his presence. A rooftop, a stable loft, a darkened corner of a tavern, these could become prisons of waiting, where time slowed and the heart pounded endlessly. Another essential skill was disguise. Unlike the knights in shining armor, Assassins thrived by blending in, a cloak pulled low, a hat tilted forward, clothes borrowed from a servant or a beggar. These small changes allowed him to vanish in plain sight. To the casual eye, he was no one of consequence. He might carry a sack of firewood, or push a cart of vegetables, or kneel in prayer. And beneath these disguises, he watched, listened, and waited for the right moment. Weapons, too, required practice. A dagger was not merely a blade, but a tool that demanded precision. Striking too shallowly might wound but not kill, allowing the victim to scream and summon help. Striking too deeply risked getting stuck in bone, slowing the escape. Crossbows, though deadly, needed steady hands, for a missed shot was not easily corrected. Poison demanded careful preparation, as a single mistake might end the assassin's own life. Thus, training was a lonely practice, one carried out in secret. A man might spend nights throwing knives at wooden posts, or testing herbs on animals to see which killed swiftly and which merely sickened. These were dangerous lessons, learned without mentors, each mistake potentially fatal. The social world of an assassin was equally bleak. They did not belong to the respected orders of knights, monks, or craftsmen. They could not boast of belonging to a guild, nor seek the protection of law. Instead, they lived in the margins, neither entirely criminal nor entirely free. Some found shelter among thieves, who accepted them as kin. Others sought the company of mercenaries, men who also lived by the sword, though for different purposes. But even in such company, the assassin remained apart, never fully trusted, always half-feared. There were, of course, tales of organized brotherhoods of assassins' groups bound together by codes, rituals, and loyalty. Some of these tales were rooted in truth, such as the Nizari Ismailis in the Middle East, who used targeted killings as part of their political strategy. In Europe, however, most assassins acted alone, or in loose networks bound by convenience rather than loyalty. The idea of secret brotherhoods fascinated medieval minds, but in reality, assassins were usually solitary figures, drifting wherever need and coin carried them. Their clients were varied. A noble might hire one to remove a rival. A merchant might seek their aid in eliminating competition. Even bishops and abbots, despite their holy vows, sometimes turned to such services when disputes grew bitter enough. This created a strange irony. The assassin might act on behalf of men who preached morality, who wore fine robes, who knelt in chapels, yet the deed itself remained hidden, unspoken, denied by those who benefited. The assassin's hand was used, but his name was never acknowledged, and so his training, his craft, and his social world all prepared him for a life in which he was both necessary and despised. He was the shadow called upon when light became inconvenient. He was the whisper that others wanted spoken but never claimed. He was, in every way, a tooler sharp blade wielded briefly, then discarded when its purpose was fulfilled. For those who entered this profession, there was no honor, there was no pride. There was only survival, and even that was uncertain. And as we explore further into their world, we see more clearly why being a medieval assassin was less a choice than a curse, one that carried with it the weight of secrecy, solitude, and eternal danger. If we were to follow a medieval assassin through an ordinary day, the first thing we would notice is that such days were rarely ordinary. There was no routine that could be relied upon, no pattern of life that could be repeated with comfort. Each morning might begin in a different town, in a different bed, sometimes in a stable loft, sometimes under an open sky. For the assassin, stability was a luxury he could never afford. To stay too long in one place was to invite suspicion. To linger was to risk discovery. Travel defined much of his existence. A wanderer by necessity, he moved through villages, market, towns, and cities, always seeking to remain unseen, always adapting to new surroundings. Travel was not comfortable. The roads of medieval Europe were often little more than muddy tracks, rutted by carts and flooded by rain. Bandits prowled in the woods, and tollkeepers demanded coin at bridges and gates. For ordinary travelers, such dangers were inconvenient. For the assassin, they were dull. A thief on the road might recognize him as a man carrying weapons and see him as prey. A gatekeeper might demand to know his business and note his face too carefully. Each encounter was another risk, and so he learned to pass as humbly as possible, never drawing notice. His belongings were few. He carried a cloak, a pouch with coins, perhaps a second set of clothes if fortune allowed. His weapons were concealed, as best as possible daggers tucked into boots or belts, sometimes wrapped in cloth to appear as harmless tools. A crossbow, if carried at all, was taken apart, hidden beneath bundles, for such a weapon instantly marked. A man as dangerous. An assassin carried no banners, wore no armor, displayed no wealth. He could not afford to be. He was a man who passed through life like a shadow, leaving behind as little trace as possible. Food was often a concern. An assassin could not always dine in taverns, for taverns were places of talk, of eyes watching strangers. Instead, he ate what he could purchase quietly from market stalls: bread, cheese, dried fish, or fruit when it was in season. On the road, he might trap rabbits, forage berries, or chew hard crusts saved from days before. Hunger was not unusual, and sometimes fasting was necessary, especially when lying in wait for a target. To eat too much, to drink too heavily, was a mistake. A dull body could not act swiftly, and a dull mind could not notice danger. Thus, restraint became part of his diet, as much as bread or water. Sleep was equally uncertain. Rarely could he rest peacefully in the same place for more than a night or two. A cheap bed in a crowded inn offered warmth, but also risk. A question from a curious innkeeper, a drunken stranger's stare, or the slip of a name could unravel the disguise he worked so hard to maintain. Sometimes he chose barns or haystacks instead, paying a farmer a coin for silence. Other nights were spent entirely awake, waiting in alleys, crouched in corners, or perched on rooftops where he might remain unseen. Fatigue was constant, pressing upon his body, gnawing at his thoughts, but he had no choice. To be an assassin meant to accept exhaustion as part of life. Preparation was the heart of his work. Before each act, he studied. He learned the habits of the target when they left their homes, what routes they favored, which companions surrounded them. He learned when they were most vulnerable, whether walking alone at dawn, or resting in prayer, or dining late in halls, whether laughter grew too loud to notice footsteps in the dark. This study was slow, sometimes stretching across weeks. Patience was more deadly than the dagger. Striking too soon risked failure. Striking too late risked losing the opportunity entirely. But while patience was necessary, it was also torment. To follow a man day after day, to watch him eat, laugh, and speak with family, was to see him as human. The assassin had to fight against the creeping sense of sympathy. To dwell on the kindness in a target's smile, or the innocence of his children, was to hesitate at the wrong moment, and hesitation in this profession was fatal. Thus, the assassin hardened his mind, teaching himself to think of the target, not as a person, but as a task. Paranoia, too, became a constant companion. The assassin never knew who might be watching him in return. A rival could betray him. A client could change his mind and decide to silence him instead of paying him. The local sheriff might receive word of a suspicious stranger. Every face in a crowd might conceal danger. Every word whispered behind him might concern his name. This unending suspicion gnawed at him until it shaped his very being. He walked with his back to walls, sat where he could see doorways, never drank from cups he had not watched being poured. The assassin could never relax, not fully, not even when the job was done. Even after completing a task, his work was not finished. Escape was as important as the strike itself. Without escape, the act became suicide. Routes had to be chosen in advance, horses prepared if necessary, disguises readied for the moment of flight. Sometimes he vanished into the crowd, slipping away as if he had never been there. Other times he disappeared into wilderness, walking for days until the scent of pursuit grew faint. But always he moved on. There was no returning to normalcy, no enjoying the spoils openly. Whatever coin he earned, it was hidden, hoarded, spent only in careful measure. A single display of wealth could reveal the truth to those who wondered how a wandering beggar suddenly carried silver dot. Thus, the daily life of a medieval assassin was marked by discomfort and fear, hunger, fatigue, paranoia, and endless caution weighed upon him. His existence was never grand, never celebrated. Unlike knights who paraded in tournaments or merchants who showed off their fine goods, the assassin remained invisible. His reward was not recognition, but survival. And survival, for him, was fragile at best. When the moment finally came to act, the assassin's life narrowed to a single thread. All of the waiting, the watching, the careful restraint, everything bent toward this single point of decision. And yet, unlike the battles fought by knights or soldiers, there was no glory in it. No banners unfurled, no songs sung, no shouts of victory to echo across fields. An assassination was quiet, often clumsy, sometimes messy. It was work done in shadows, and its success was measured not in triumph, but in escape. There were many methods by which an assassin might kill, and none of them were easy. The dagger was perhaps the most common weapon, for it was small, concealed, and deadly at close range. But to use a dagger meant coming face to face with the target. It meant pushing through guards, or slipping through doors, or waiting in narrow alleys where footsteps echoed loud in the night. It meant risking the sound of a startled cry, the flash of recognition in a victim's eyes, the sudden strength of a man fighting for his life. Even the smallest misstep, a blade catching on clothing, a stumble on uneven ground, could ruin the plan and bring ruin upon the assassin. Other weapons offered distance, but with their own dangers. The crossbow, for instance, could strike a man from across a courtyard or down a darkened street. But crossbows were large, slow to reload, and difficult to conceal. To carry one was to risk immediate suspicion, and to fire one was to invite a search for the shooter. An assassin who chose this path had to plan his escape meticulously, for there was rarely a second chance once the bolt was loosed. Poison, too, was an ancient tool of killers. Slipped into wine, stirred into stews, dusted onto bread, it worked. Silently, and left little trace in an age before science could unravel such mysteries. But poison was not easy to acquire, nor to administer. The assassin had to find a way into kitchens, cellars, or private chambers. He had to win the trust of servants, or deceive tavern keepers, or masquerade as a tradesman. Each layer of deception carried risk. If caught tampering with a goblet, there would be no excuse believable enough to spare his life. And even when poison worked, it worked slowly. The assassin could not linger to see the result. He had to vanish, never certain if his work had been completed or discovered before it took effect. Strangulation and ambush were other methods, brutal and direct. A garrote slipped round a throat in an alley, a sudden blow with a cudgel from behind a door. These were acts of raw physical force, and they demanded both courage and cruelty. But they also left bodies in places where they might be found too quickly, where alarm might spread before the assassin had time to escape. And the closer the act, the greater the chance of struggle, of injury, of failure, no matter the method. Each attempt required not only skill, but nerve. For in the final moments, the assassin faced the greatest enemy of all his own fear. To approach a man who might cry out, who might resist, who might be guarded by loyal companions, demanded a stillness of spirit that few could summon. Failure meant death, often by slow and public means. Capture did not bring mercy. Torture awaited, and confession and execution in front of jeering crowds. This knowledge pressed heavily on every breath as the assassin drew near to his victim. Imagine, then, the quiet of a medieval street at night, the flicker of torches on wooden beams, the smell of tallow smoke and damp earth. An assassin waits in a shadowed corner, listening to the footsteps of a man approaching, the jangle of a belt buckle, the rhythm of speech as guards laugh at some joke. The assassin's hand grips the hilt of a dagger hidden beneath his cloak. His heart beats loudly in his chest, though he has trained himself to breathe slow and steady. He knows he has only a moment to act, only a moment when all the patterns he has studied will align the absence of witnesses, the curve of the street, the hesitation of the guard. Then he must strike, swiftly, silently, and without error. Sometimes it worked. The target fell, a life ended in an instant, and the assassin slipped away into the maze of streets. But just as often, things went wrong. A guard might turn his head at the wrong moment. A victim might stumble and cry out. A weapon might break, or a door might stick, or a witness might emerge from the dark carrying a lantern. The smallest detail, overlooked or misjudged, could transform success into disaster. And in that disaster, the assassin faced the full fury of medieval justice. Even when the act was successful, there was no satisfaction in it. An assassin could not linger to savor his work. He fled at once, disappearing into the darkness, changing his clothing, altering his walk, vanishing into a countryside that swallowed secrets as quickly as it swallowed lives. Behind him, panic might spread. Bells might ring, torches might be lit, soldiers might scour the streets. But he would not look back. To look back was to risk being caught. Survival demanded only forward motion. And what did he gain from such risk? Payment, perhaps. A purse of coins pressed into his hand by a patron who now owed him nothing. Sometimes that payment was delayed, or reduced, or refused altogether. The assassin had little recourse. He could hardly appeal to the law or shout for justice in a marketplace. If he was cheated in silence. His labor was not protected by guilds, nor honored by nobles, nor respected by the people. It was work done in shadows, paid for in shadows, and remembered, if at all, only in whispers. Thus, Each assassination was not a triumph, but a burden. Each act deepened the assassin's isolation, his fear, his distance from any life resembling peace. Success brought survival, but survival was never enough. And so the assassin lived on, carrying with him the weight of faces he could not forget, the echo of cries he could not silence, the endless knowledge that he would never be free of the life he had chosen, nor the life that had chosen him. If an assassin survived the moment of the strike, the true ordeal had only just begun. Escape was not an afterthought. It was half the work. A knight might stride proudly from the battlefield, wounds bound and victories counted, but an assassin could never afford to linger. He had to vanish into the fabric of medieval life as though he had never been there at all. This meant knowing the city as intimately as a rat knew the sewers. Assassins memorized alleys, counted doors, tested shortcuts. They knew which taverns would lock their doors against pursuers, which barns lay empty at night, which monasteries would offer sanctuary for a coin slipped into a monk's hand. Sometimes they disappeared into pilgrim garb, pretending to be one of the many who traveled the roads in search of holy shrines. Other times they shaved their beards, cut their hair, or disguised themselves as merchants. Yet disguises were fragile. Things and rumor was quicker than travel. A description whispered in the market at dawn might spread across the town by noon. No matter how far he ran, the assassin never escaped the knowledge that someone, somewhere, might be hunting him still. Nor did he ever truly escape suspicion. Unlike knights or mercenaries, assassins had no banners, no badges, no official contracts to shield them. They worked outside the law, and so the law itself became their enemy. At best, they were tools in the hands of powerful men. At worst, they were discarded once their usefulness had ended. A patron who had promised wealth and protection might suddenly turn cold. Payment might be reduced to a handful of coins, or withheld entirely. And if the assassination brought too much scrutiny, the patron could solve the problem by sacrificing the assassin himself, handing him over to the authorities, or having him quietly eliminated to erase all traces of the plot. This constant sense of betrayal seeped into the assassin's bones. Every ally was a potential traitor. Every friend might one day decide the risks outweighed the loyalty. The assassin slept lightly, never trusting the silence of night. He often changed his lodgings, moving from one quarter to another, never staying long enough to become known. He drank little, for drunkenness made men vulnerable. He trusted few, and often spoke little, for even words could become weapons in the mouths of informants. But perhaps the worst consequence of all was the toll taken on the assassin's spirit. Killing was not as clean or as simple as the sagas made it seem. In truth, it was often clumsy, brutal, and unforgettable. The assassin remembered the feel of resistance as a blade struck flesh, the sound of a dying man's breath, the weight of a body crumpling to the ground. These things lingered. They intruded on sleep, turning dreams into nightmares. They haunted waking moments, filling quiet silences with echoes of the past. Some men grew hardened, their hearts sealed against pity. Others grew hollow, worn down by the burden of memory until they felt less like men and more like shadows of themselves. And what reward justified such suffering? Rarely wealth, for assassins were seldom paid generously, and what they earned was often spent quickly on bribes, safe passage, or weapons. Rarely honor, for there was none in deeds done from behind. Rarely security, for each success only sharpened the desire of others to see the assassin silenced. More often than not, Assassins lived short lives, ended by the very violence they had practiced. Even when death did not come swiftly, it came harshly. Many were caught and executed, their bodies displayed as warnings to others. Some were tortured, their confessions wrung from them before jeering crowds. Others were betrayed by patrons who preferred silence over loyalty. And a few simply disappeared, lost to the endless dangers of travel and disease that stalked the Middle Ages. The image of the assassin as a silent, romantic figure cloaked in mystery belongs more to legend than to history. The truth was far grimmer. To live as a medieval assassin was to live without trust, without peace, without certainty. It was to live in constant fear of discovery, fear of betrayal, fear of the memories that clung like shadows even in daylight. And yet, men still took up this life. Why? Perhaps because they had no other path. Some were outlaws already, with no way back into society. Some were desperate for coin, willing to trade their lives for a chance at survival. Some were bound to lords or secret orders, compelled to kill by loyalty or coercion. And some, perhaps, found a dark purpose in it, a sense of belonging in a world that had cast them aside. But in the end, the life of a medieval assassin was not one of power, but of peril. It was not a story of glory, but of shadows. It was not a path toward freedom, but toward an early grave. And this is why it truly sucked to be a medieval assassin. If we want to understand why the life of a medieval assassin was so harsh, we have to step back and look at the world that created him. Medieval Europe was a society built on hierarchy. Every man and woman was slotted into a place. Peasants worked the land, craftsmen labored in towns, merchants traded goods, nobles governed, and kings ruled at the top. The church stretched its influence across all of it, offering divine approval for the existing order. In such a rigid structure, there was little room for those who lived in shadows. Assassins, by their very nature, defied that order. Kings and lords fought wars with banners, knights, and proclamations. They fought in the open, with armies marching across fields and sieges grinding down castles. Even when the fighting was bloody and cruel, it carried an aura of legitimacy. But assassins worked outside these rules. They struck unseen, and their violence could topple power not with armies but with a single blade that was both the source of their usefulness and the reason they were so reviled. The politics of the medieval world were treacherous. Noble families plotted against one another, kings feared rivals, and even bishops sought advantage. In courts filled with whispers, assassins became tools of opportunity. A rival too strong to confront directly might fall victim to an accident. A lord, beset by rebellious vassals, might hire a killer to quietly remove one rather than risk open war. A bishop threatened by rivals might employ someone to silence a critic. Yet the very secrecy that made assassins effective also made them disposable. No lord wished to be publicly tied to an act of murder, especially one carried out in such dishonorable fashion. If an assassin succeeded, the patron might quietly reward him but keep him at arm's length. If he failed, the patron might be the first to denounce him, claiming ignorance and loyalty to the law. Assassins, then, lived on the edge of politics, but never within it. They were shadows on the wall, never part of the grand tapestries woven. In the halls of King's Dot, the church, to cast its judgment against assassins. Murder was a sin, and while knights could claim the blessing of just war, assassins had no such protection. Priests thundered against secret killings from their pulpits, branding them the work of the devil. The famous medieval chroniclers often recorded assassinations not as acts of courage, but as examples of betrayal and cowardice. The assassin's name rarely survived in history. Only the death of the victim was remembered. This erasure was another kind of punishment. To kill was to risk being forgotten, even as your victim's fate was immortalized. Society, too, distrusted assassins. Ordinary people might not know who carried out a murder, but they lived in fear of the unseen hand. If a lord could be struck down in his hall, who was safe? Markets, taverns, and villages buzzed with rumors whenever a notable figure fell to mysterious violence. Folk tales grew around such events, painting assassins as faceless demons, lurking in alleys or slipping through windows at night. To live as an assassin was to carry the weight of society's suspicion, even if one's identity remained hidden. And yet, despite the disdain, assassins persisted because rulers needed them. Open war was costly, men died, crops burned, castles fell. But one blade in the dark could end a conflict before it began. A single killing could shift the balance of power. So long as politics required ruthless tools, there would always be someone willing to fill the role. The tragedy, however, is that assassins were never truly masters of their own fates. They were pawns, shuffled across a chessboard by hands far greater than theirs. A king might smile and thank an assassin for his service, but the same king could order his death the next day if it suited him. A noble might pay handsomely for one murder, but quietly arrange for the assassin's execution to cover her own tracks. To be an assassin was to live always at the mercy of those who claimed to employ you. This fragile position meant that assassins could never fully enjoy power, wealth, or even reputation. They were feared, yes, but fear does not bring loyalty. They were used, yes, but tools are cast aside when they dull. In a world obsessed with legacy, assassins had none. Knights had their coats of arms, monks their manuscripts, kings their chronicles. But assassins left little more than stains of blood on the floor and whispers of treachery in the wind. Their position in medieval society was a paradox. They were needed but unwanted, powerful yet powerless, remembered only in fragments, and it is within this paradox that their suffering deepened, for they carried the burden of history's most despised work without ever reaping its rewards. If you were to walk the streets of a medieval city, you would see the divisions of society plain as day. The gilded halls of noble families stood tall, the spires of churches rose above the skyline, and the cramped hovels of peasants clustered in the shadows of the walls. For most people, life was defined by one word: survival. Food was scarce, winters were brutal, and opportunities to rise above one's station was slim. In such a world, the path into becoming an assassin was rarely a choice born of ambition. More often, it was desperation. Many assassins began life as orphans of war. Battles swept across Europe with alarming frequency. Lords feuded, kingdoms splintered, and foreign invaders clashed on the frontiers. When armies clashed, villages burned. Children who survived these calamities often found themselves alone, wandering roads lined with corpses, with no family, no farm, and no one to claim them. These children were easy prey for those seeking to mold killers. Some were taken in by criminal gangs operating in the underbelly of cities. These groups thrived in shadows, running smuggling rings, gambling dens, and brothels. They recognized the value of a boy or girl with nothing left to lose. To such gangs, a desperate child was clay to be shaped. They could be taught to pickpockets, climb walls, and eventually to kill. Others were scooped up by mercenary companies. War did not only create orphans, it also created industries of violence. Mercenaries roamed Europe, fighting for pay wherever conflict arose. Some captains, less scrupulous than others, found it useful to have assassins in their employ. These killers were not meant for battlefields, but for camp raids, infiltrations, and silencing enemy leaders before they could rally their forces. Such recruits were hardened quickly, their innocence stripped away in service of coin. There were also patrons of higher birth who directly cultivated assassins. Some noble courts, particularly those embroiled in long feuds, quietly trained men for tasks too dishonorable to assign to knights. These men were often peasants or commoners brought into service, offered food, shelter, and the promise of reward. Once under the control of such lords, they were bound by oaths and threats alike. To betray a master was to invite certain death. Training was brutal. Assassins learned how to move silently in cities and castles, how to disguise themselves in cloaks and shadows. They were taught where armor was weakest, how to use daggers and short swords designed for quick, efficient kills. Some learned the art of poison, though this was dangerous both to prepare and to use, for discovery meant immediate condemnation. Climbing was another essential skill. Assassins scaled walls, slipped through windows, and balanced across rooftops like cats. The city was their battlefield, and every alley a potential ambush. The psychological shaping was just as cruel, too. Take a human life is no easy thing, no matter how desperate one's situation. Patrons and trainers knew this. They hardened recruits with violence. They demanded obedience through fear punishments for hesitation, humiliation for mistakes, threats against anyone the assassin might care for. Over time, the act of killing became less a choice and more a reflex. Assassins were conditioned to strike swiftly, without questioning. Yet even in training, there was isolation. An assassin could never truly belong to the community that raised him. If trained by a gang, he was a tool, not a brother. If trained by mercenaries, he was an expendable asset. If trained by nobles, he was property, a shadow employed when knights and banners could not be risked. In every case, assassins occupied a strange limbo, present yet apart, alive yet not free. Loyalty was enforced not by honor but by manipulation. Patrons paid in coin, but coin was never enough. To keep assassins obedient, lords often alternated between reward and terror. They promised safety but delivered threats. They dangled the possibility of freedom but kept it always out of reach. Some gave their assassins luxuries: a fine cloak, a better weapon, a warm bed in a hidden corner of the castle, only to remind them that it could all be taken away. Others bound assassins through guilt or blackmail, ensuring they had nowhere else to turn. It was not uncommon for an assassin to wonder whether he was truly human in the eyes of his masters. Knights were celebrated for their loyalty, their banners carried proudly in parades. But assassins were kept in the shadows, denied recognition, their names erased from memory. If they died alone. If they lived as instruments of fear. This path of recruitment and training shows why so few people chose the life willingly. To be an assassin was rarely a dream. It was the result of circumstance, coercion, and cruelty. And once a person entered this world, leaving it was nearly impossible. The shadows swallowed them, and the light of ordinary life slipped forever beyond reach. If you try to imagine the life of a medieval assassin, you might picture endless, action-secret missions every night, daring escapes, dramatic stabbings under the cover of moonlight. The reality, however, was much quieter, and in many ways, Much worse, most assassins spent far more time waiting than acting. Missions were rare. A patron might only call upon them once every few weeks, sometimes even less. Until then, they had to disappear into the folds of society. To survive, they lived double lives, passing themselves off as beggars, peddlers, wandering laborers, or nondescript townsfolk. Blending in was their greatest protection. This existence required constant calculation. If an assassin dressed too well, he would attract suspicion from neighbors. If he dressed too poorly, he might be mistaken for a vagrant and driven out of town. He had to walk a careful line between invisibility and normality. Even small details mattered. How often he appeared in the marketplace, how much bread he bought, how he carried himself in public. Every gesture was an act of camouflage. Lodging was another problem. Unlike knights who lived in castles or monks who lived in cloisters, assassins had no fixed home. Some rented tiny rooms in taverns, moving constantly to avoid recognition. Others slept in barns, cellars, or abandoned buildings. A few fortunate ones were allowed safe houses, hidden quarters provided by their masters, but these were rare luxuries. More often, the assassin was a drifter, carrying his belongings in a bundle, forever unsettled. The nights were the loneliest. By daylight, an assassin could merge into the flow of city life, surrounded by noise and distraction. But at night, when shutters closed and candles were snuffed, the silence pressed heavily. Solitude was not a choice, but a necessity. Assassins could not risk forming families, for their enemies would target loved ones. Friendships were dangerous too, since even a slip of the tongue might reveal their hidden work. In time, many assassins became shadows of themselves, their humanity eroded by secrecy, and then there was the paranoia. Every footstep behind them could be a pursuer. Every glance could be suspicion. A rival assassin might be stalking them. A servant of the church might be hunting them as a sinner. A loyal knight might be watching for vengeance. Even when they were not on a mission, assassins lived as if someone might strike them down at any moment. It was a heavy burden. Imagine waking each morning not knowing whether you would live to see the next. Imagine eating bread while staring at the door, wondering if it would burst open with armed men. Imagine sleeping lightly, never truly resting, because even dreams could not soothe your nerves. That was the life of the medieval assassin. Endless vigilance, endless fear. Money offered little comfort. Patrons paid well compared to what peasants earned, but the pay was sporadic. Sometimes assassins were rewarded in silver coins, other times in gold, but it was never secure. If their patron died or lost power, the assassin was cut adrift. Worse still, payment was often withheld until after the deed was done, meaning that the assassin risked everything without guarantee of reward. Some were betrayed outright, killed or imprisoned by the very lords who had hired them, so no coin would ever need to be paid. The assassin's role in society was contradictory. They were both useful and despised. Patrons relied on them, yet publicly denied their existence. Townsfolk whispered of mysterious killings but pretended not to know who was responsible. The church condemned assassination as sinful, yet even bishops sometimes hired such men to deal with rivals quietly. In this sense, assassins were both essential and expendable, needed yet shunned. Such a position took its toll. To know that you would never be honored, never praised, never remembered, gnawed at the spirit. Knights were celebrated in songs. Merchants gained wealth and respect. Priests were revered for their piety, but assassins remained nameless. If they succeeded, their patron claimed the glory. If they failed, they bore all the blame. This invisibility created a sense of erasure. To be an assassin was to live without legacy. You could not leave behind a family, a name, or even a gravestone that declared who you were. Your existence was consumed by secrecy, your death swallowed by silence. And the cruelest irony was this: the better you were at your craft, the less anyone would ever know you existed. It is little wonder that many assassins turned to drink or vice in the quiet hours. With no community to ground them and no hope for redemption, they sought escape wherever they could find it. But even this carried risk, for drunken words could be overheard, and indulgence might dull the sharp edge of their survival. Every fleeting comfort was poisoned by danger. Thus, the daily life of an assassin was not one of glamour or thrill, but of monotony, fear, and isolation. Death did not only lurk at the end of a mission, it haunted them in every waking moment. Religion hung over every life in the Middle Ages like a heavy cloud, and for the assassin, it was no different. In fact, it was worse, because while peasants might struggle with sins of envy or gluttony, and knights might wrestle with pride, assassins carried the burden of murder, the gravest sin of all. The church taught that murder was a direct path to damnation, and few things terrified a medieval person more than the thought of eternal hellfire. Even hardened killers could not shake this fear. Priests preached of torment that would last forever, flames that burned without consuming, demons who mocked and tortured the wicked, a pit from which no soul would ever climb. For an assassin, each killing was a nail hammered into the coffin of their soul. Of course, some tried to justify their actions. If the patron was a nobleman or bishop, assassins sometimes told themselves they were serving a higher order. "It is not my sin," they might whisper. "I only follow the will of my master." But deep down, most knew this was hollow. The church made it clear: intent did not absolve the act. To shed blood was to stain one's soul, no matter who gave the command. Confession was tricky. Ordinary villagers might go to the parish priest and list their sins. But what could an assassin say? "Father, forgive me, for I have killed 3 men this week, 1 by poison, 2 by knife." To confess openly was to risk exposure, arrest, and execution. Thus many assassins carried their guilt in silence, never unburdening themselves, never seeking absolution. Their sins festered in the mind like a rot, growing heavier with each passing year. The mental toll was immense. Assassins lived not only with fear of discovery, but also with the constant replay of their deeds. Faces of the dead would haunt their dreams. The sound of a victim's final gasp might echo in their ears. Even if they steeled themselves in the moment, later the memory would return, gnawing at the edges of sanity. Some numbed themselves with wine, some with opium, others with cold indifference, but no one could escape the weight forever. And then there were the doubts. What if the man they killed had been innocent of crime? What if a child starved because its father had been taken? What if a kingdom fell to ruin because of one hidden blade? The assassin's role was to obey, not to question, but the questions came all the same. In quiet moments, they wondered, had they served justice or only cruelty? This torment often ended in grim ways. Very few assassins lived to old age. Some were caught and executed hanged in the public square or broken on the wheel, their bodies left as warnings. Others were betrayed by their own patrons, eliminated once their usefulness had ended. A few were slain by rivals or victims, kin seeking vengeance. And for those rare few who survived into later years, Obscurity was their fate. No songs, no stories, just a quiet death in a nameless place, buried in unmarked soil. The greatest irony was that assassins, who shaped the fate of kings and nobles with their silent work, rarely shaped their own. Their lives were written in shadows, and their deaths erased them completely. History, after all, remembers the rulers, not the nameless hand that slipped the blade between their ribs. And yet, despite all this, new assassins always appeared. Poverty drove some, desperation drove others, and the lure of power that chance, however fleeting, to matter in a world that treated peasants like cattle was enough to tempt the rest. But for nearly all who walk this path, it ended the same way, with fear, guilt, loneliness, and the certainty that they would never find peace in this life or the next. So when we strip away the myths and the romantic tales, when we look past the fantasy of silent heroes in hooded cloaks, what remains is bleak. The life of a medieval assassin was not one of glory, but one of shadows. It was a life where every coin earned dripped with blood, where every night was haunted by unseen eyes, and where the greatest enemy was not the sword of another, but the crushing weight of one's own conscience. That is why, for all their skill and secrecy, it truly sucked to be a medieval assassin. When people today hear the word assassin, they often imagine a figure of elegance and mystery, a cloaked man slipping silently across rooftops, a shadow in the torchlight, a master of secrets and danger. Popular stories, novels, films, and even modern games have done much to paint assassins as daring rebels, fighting tyrants in silence. Yet the reality, as history shows us, was far less glamorous. Myths tend to grow in the fertile soil of fear and ignorance. For those who lived in the Middle Ages, assassins were whispered about more than seen. Rumors carried their name farther than their blades ever could. A nobleman might be slain, and in the absence of truth, people filled the gaps with tales of hooded killers who leaped from spires or vanished into smoke. In reality, the assassin's methods were usually far simpler. A dagger in a crowded street, a poisoned cup at supper, a push from a balcony when no one was looking. But simplicity rarely captures the imagination. People wanted stories that thrilled, that made sense of chaos. So assassins became larger than life. Chroniclers described them with near magical abilities, striking with inhuman speed, never failing, always vanishing into the night. The more frightening and mysterious the stories, the more power rulers could claim when they survived such attempts. An enemy who hired mere thugs was forgettable, but an enemy who commanded assassins, that was the mark of a true and dangerous rival. This distortion only grew over centuries. By the Renaissance, playwrights and poets spun assassins into their dramas as exotic and dangerous figures. They became part of the stage, no longer ordinary men driven by coin or fear, but symbols of betrayal, vengeance, or destiny. Their grim reality, poverty, guilt, and short lifespans was washed away in favor of narrative flair. And yet, even within the Middle Ages themselves, this contrast between reality and story already existed. A villager might hear that a king had fallen by an assassin's hand and imagine a scene of dark romance, even as the actual killer, a nervous and underfed mercenary, was already being hunted down in the alleys. To the killer, life was a blur of danger and dread. To everyone else, it was legend. Why does this myth survive even now? Perhaps because the idea of the assassin touches something deep within the human imagination. They embody fear, the fear of a blade that can undo the mightiest king. They embody rebellion, the notion that no ruler, however powerful, is beyond reach. And they embody freedom, the ability, at least in story, to move unseen and unbound, to slip through the cracks of society. But the truth we've explored is harsher. A medieval assassin was not a hero, not a freedom fighter, not even a noble villain. He was, more often than not, a desperate man caught between hunger and duty, trapped in a life that offered him little but shadows. His work was dangerous, his nights sleepless, his soul burdened with sins he could never confess. He was feared, yes, but also doomed. It is here, in this gap between story and reality, that we begin to understand why it truly sucked to be an assassin in the Middle Ages. The tales that glamorize them are not entirely false. They capture the idea of the assassin. But ideas do not bleed. Real men did. And perhaps that is why the myth endures. Because the truth is too bleak, too sad, and too ordinary to satisfy us. Legends comfort us. Reality does not. The romantic veil draped across the assassin's image might have dazzled others. But for the assassin himself, it offered no shelter from the crushing weight of reality. Every night carried its own brand of fear, not the cinematic kind that excites audiences, but the gnawing dread of being caught, tortured, and executed in ways too terrible to imagine. Punishment for hired killers was rarely swift. Kings and nobles did not wish merely to end their lives. They wanted to make them. Examples: that meant drawn-out executions in public squares, cruel tortures designed to extract confessions and, perhaps more importantly, to terrify others who might consider such a path. The assassin lived knowing that one slip, one unlucky turn, could reduce him to a broken spectacle in chains. Yet, even without the noose, there were inner punishments. Imagine the weight of a life built on death. Every face seen in the final moments of a victim, every pair of eyes that widened in shock, every muffled gasp or whispered prayer. These moments did not vanish when the dagger was sheathed. They lingered, they followed. The assassin might drink to forget, or force himself into the cold numbness of repetition, but memory always clawed its way back. This burden grew heavier for those who were coerced into such work. Not every killer was a willing participant in this grim trade. Some were, pressed into service by lords who demanded loyalty at the edge of a sword. Others were men ruined by debt, given a single choice: kill or face ruin. In such cases, the assassin was less a predator and more a trapped animal, forced to lunge or perish. The myths, of course, rarely showed this side. To the storyteller, the assassin was an exotic archetype. He stood outside normal society, cloaked in mystery. That image, however, masked the terrible loneliness of such an existence. Who could an assassin trust? Friends might betray him for coin, and family ties were dangerous vulnerabilities. Many cut themselves off from loved ones entirely, living as shadows in taverns and alleyways, hiding behind false names. A life of invisibility may sound exciting to those who dream of anonymity, but in truth, it was a prison with no doors. And then there was the matter of religion. The medieval world was one soaked in faith, where sin and salvation shaped daily life. To kill was to carry a mark on the soul, one that priests could not easily wash away. For some assassins, confession was impossible. To reveal the truth to a priest would risk exposure. For others, confession brought no comfort. For how could a man who killed for hire ever truly repent if he intended to kill again? Imagine living in a time when the terror of damnation was not abstract, but ever present. Every mission was not only a risk to body, but also to eternal soul. Fear of death in battle was common across the medieval world, but the assassin's fear was unique. Soldiers could justify their violence as service to a cause or loyalty to their lord. Bandits could excuse theirs as necessity, born of hunger or desperation. But the assassin killed with precision, by design, in silence. He could not frame his work as an accident of war or a crime of poverty. It was murder by appointment, arranged like a business, and business it was. Payment came in coins, sometimes promised, often delayed, occasionally stolen altogether by those who thought killing the killer was cheaper than paying him. Imagine the bitter irony, risking your life to end another's, only to be cheated. Out of the price you were promised, an assassin could not exactly appeal to a court of law to collect his fee. Trusting one's patrons was as dangerous as approaching one's prey. Even success brought no guarantee of freedom. A noble might reward an assassin with wealth or protection for a single task, but more often, that success only chained him tighter. Once a man had killed once, he was branded for life. His patrons knew he could not turn to honest work without suspicion. He was trapped in the shadows he had entered, condemned to serve again and again, until inevitably his luck ran out. This endless cycle, combined with the myths that glorified the assassin, created a painful paradox. To the world, he was a figure of dark romance. To himself, he was a doomed soul, cursed to live on the margins, waiting for the knife meant for him. And so, while we may enjoy the stories told centuries later, the tales of stealthy rooftop chasers, of hooded figures whispering oaths of freedom, we should remember that these tales are illusions. They are echoes of fear and fascination, not mirrors of truth. The truth was much more mundane and far more tragic. A man who could not escape. The blood on his hands, even in sleep. If the life of a medieval assassin was harsh in its beginning and cruel in its middle years, then its end was almost always bleaker still. The passage of time was the one adversary that no blade could cut down, and for a man whose livelihood depended on his agility, eyesight, and steady hand, age was its own death sentence. The young assassin, sharp and strong, could scale walls, hide in shadows, and strike before an opponent even realized what was happening. But as years passed, joints stiffened, reflexes dulled, and stamina waned. What once came effortlessly now required effort, and in this line of work, the tiniest hesitation, the smallest falter, could be the difference between success and capture. The cruel irony was that the assassin could never truly retire. Unlike soldiers who might return to farms, or craftsmen who could pass their trade to apprentices, assassins carried with them a reputation that barred them from honest life. Who would employ a man whispered to have slit throats in the night? Who would welcome such a man into a guild, or trust him to live peaceably beside neighbors? Even if no one could prove his past, rumors were enough to taint his name. Thus, many aging assassins faced a grim fork in the road. They continued their deadly work long after their bodies had begun to betray them. Or they lived in perpetual hiding, waiting for the inevitable moment when an old debt, a vengeful relative, or a discarded employer came to settle accounts. Betrayal was perhaps the most consistent end. In a profession built on secrecy and silence, loyalty was an illusion. Patrons who once needed the assassin often turned against him to erase loose ends. What safer way to bury a secret than to bury the man who carried it? Promised payment could dissolve into accusations. and a noble could quickly transform an indispensable tool into a condemned criminal, offering him up to the gallows to clear their conscience and reputation. And betrayal did not always come from patrons. Fellow assassins were no safer. Competition was fierce, trust non-existent. Two men hired for the same task might turn their blades on each other for a larger share of payment, or simply to eliminate a rival. An older assassin in particular was easy prey, his diminished skills making him a tempting target for younger, hungrier killers who wished to prove themselves. Even without betrayal, the assassin's own conscience could eventually become an enemy. For years, perhaps decades, he might drown out the faces of the dead. But as the body weakened, so too did the mental walls he had built. It is said that in quiet moments, assassins sometimes muttered to themselves, as though haunted by the ghosts of those they had struck down. Nights brought dreams that were not dreams at all, but vivid replays of death. The blade flashing, the gasp, the silence that followed. These were not the imagined nightmares of storytellers, but the very real wages of memory, collected with cruel interest as age advanced. Illness compounded these burdens. Medieval medicine was primitive, and an assassin's lifestyle rarely allowed the luxury of proper care. Injuries sustained in the line of work, untreated infections, scars that tightened across muscles all became chronic torments. A limp from a poorly healed wound could render a man useless for stealth. A trembling hand could make even the simplest kill impossible. And so the assassin's body, once his greatest ally, turned steadily against him, stripping him of the one thing that gave him power. What then was left for such a man? A rare few might seek redemption, entering monasteries under false names, hoping to vanish into prayer and obscurity. But more often than not, the past followed them. A face recognized, a rumor whispered, and suddenly the sanctuary of the cloister was broken by soldiers' boots. For those who escaped detection, there remained the problem of conscience. Could years of silent prayer truly undo decades of blood? Many doubted it. Others attempted to vanish into distant lands, disguising themselves as wanderers or mercenaries. Yet no disguise could last forever. Sooner or later, someone always asked questions. And in a tightly knit medieval world, where strangers were often mistrusted, answers were dangerous. Most, however, ended as they had lived, violently, caught in the act, betrayed by a patron, killed by rivals, or simply hunted down as a scapegoat. For another man's crime, assassins rarely died peacefully in their beds. Their stories were not the tales of noble warriors passing on legacies, but of solitary figures whose names were forgotten, whose bodies were left to rot in ditches or displayed in cages as warnings to others. Yet perhaps the cruelest fate was not death, but survival. Imagine an old assassin, no longer feared, reduced to begging for scraps in a marketplace, the same market where once he may have stalked targets unseen. Children mock him, townsfolk spit at him, and no one knows or cares that he was once a figure whispered about in fearful tones. To fade from shadow into nothingness, to lose even the fearful respect his violence once commanded, this was a humiliation worse than execution. And so, when we strip away the myths and stories, what remains is a life of loneliness, betrayal, fear, and decline. The assassin's path was not one of glory or excitement, but of endless shadows, ending in darkness deeper than the night in which he lived. When we think of assassins today, our minds often turn to legends, novels, or sleek video games that paint their lives as glamorous and filled with thrilling adventure. A hooded figure leaping from rooftops, dispatching enemies with precision. and vanishing into the crowd without consequence. The myth is intoxicating. It offers us a world where the assassin is always in control, cleverer than kings, quicker than guards, and destined to be remembered. But reality, as we have seen, could not have been further from this myth. The medieval assassin's life was dirty, ugly, and exhausting. His work was rarely noble. It was transactional, sordid, and often short. He was not a master of grand conspiracies, but a man willing to take a coin in exchange for blood. If he succeeded, his name was hidden. If he failed, his body was broken. What little we know about these figures comes not from their own words, but from the writings of others, clerics, judges, chroniclers, and nobles who recorded their crimes with disdain or horror. Rarely were their stories told with sympathy, for society despised them. Unlike soldiers who could be celebrated, or knights who could be sung about in poems, assassins were denied even the twisted glory of recognition. They were outcasts in their own time, remembered only in passing footnotes of history. And yet, the myth has persisted. Why? Perhaps because we are fascinated by the idea of power in the powerless. The assassin, after all, was often a man of low birth. He had no titles, no lands, no banners. But with a blade in his hand and a moment in the shadows, he could topple men of power, kings, bishops, and nobles who seemed untouchable. In that sense, his story appeals to the imagination. It is the story of the commoner, striking against the mighty. But the price of this rebellion was terrible. There were no real victors among assassins. Even when their daggers struck true, the aftermath often destroyed them. The employer who had whispered promises would recoil in public horror, disavowing the deed. The assassin, who had risked everything, was left to carry all the blame, pursued by the same hands that had once guided him. The very act that made him powerful in one moment rendered him powerless the next. This contrast between myth and truth is what makes their lives so strangely tragic. For behind every whispered tale of a nobleman struck down in a chapel or a tyrant found lifeless in his chamber, there is another tale, the tale of the man who carried out that deed. His story did not end with triumph, but with flight, fear, and likely a noose. The cloak of invisibility that once shielded him also ensured that when his work was done, he was discarded, nameless and forgotten. And what of legacy? Knights had songs, kings had chronicles, saints had hagiographies. Assassins had none. Their stories were not passed down by families, for to admit descent from such men was shameful. Their skills were not passed down in guilds, for no guild of assassins ever truly existed in medieval Europe. They left behind no written manuals, no grand philosophies of stealth and secrecy. They left only silence, a silence broken occasionally by the stern words of a chronicler or the hushed warnings of townsfolk. This silence is perhaps the most haunting of all, for while other figures of history can be traced through documents, artifacts, and architecture, the assassin lives mostly in shadows. And maybe that is fitting. His life was spent in the margins, in alleyways and darkened chambers, unseen until the final, fateful moment. His afterlife in history reflects the same. Faint, obscured, barely visible, slipping away the moment one tries to grasp it. So what can we take from this grim portrait? Perhaps a reminder that history is not always what it seems. The figures who capture our imagination often lived lives far different from the ones we imagine. The assassin, so often painted as glamorous, was instead a figure to be pitied, haunted, hunted, and forgotten. His story is not one of power, but of powerlessness, not of triumph, but of tragedy. And yet, in studying these men, we learn something, not just about them, but about the world they inhabited. A world where power was fragile, where violence was currency, and where human life could be bought and sold like any commodity. A world where desperation drove men into shadows, and where those shadows consumed them whole. As our journey through the life of a medieval assassin comes to its end, one truth remains clear. Whatever myth has been woven in modern times, the reality was far darker. To live as an assassin in the Middle Ages was not to live in glory, but in fear. It was not to command respect, but to dwell forever in the margins, despised by many, forgotten by most, and destroyed by the very shadows that once gave refuge. And so, when we strip away the legends and return to the raw truth of history, we find not the romance of the blade in the night, but the heavy weight of its consequences. In the end, why did it suck to be a medieval assassin? Because it was a life where every path led to darkness, whether by betrayal, by capture, by conscience, or simply by the passage of time. A life without peace, a life without glory, a life without end except in shadow.